I'll take this to Shalmali and ask her this question directly, actually. Shalmali, even when we look at the GCM Objective 6 and even approaches to talking about, labor migration and addressing labor migration, we often find that somehow irregular workers fall through the cracks. What is, in your opinion, something that can be done to include that, irregular workers or workers who work in the informal sector in particular, in these discussions, and to ensure that workers in the informal sector also have access to decent work? How can they be part of this conversation?
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me and see me okay? Good. All right. So thank you very much for inviting me, and my apologies to everybody who's listening. I wrote my notes on my computer, so I have to turn my attention to read the screen rather than make eye contact with you. So apologies for that, but that's how it is. Life is under COVID without a printer or anything. Okay. So I'll jump right in. One question, which I was thinking about when Shabri was talking right in the beginning about this issue of the oversupply of workers, was actually one question was, why is there an oversupply of workers? And why is it that workers can be auctioned in this way? What is happening in our societies and our economies that corporations and other employers, why is it that they are being able to command whatever conditions and prices that they want, and that workers themselves are willing to become, willing to accept exploitative and working conditions? And I think this is a very important question to go into, because regardless of how much language there is in the Global Compact on human rights, I mean, I looked at it, and the preamble talks about all the different human rights treaties and conventions that the Global Compact is responding to and is under, and so on. But the reality is that migrant and refugee peoples are disenfranchised of their fundamental human rights in their home and in their destination countries and during transit. And many who may have rights at home do not have rights in another country. And many don't have rights either place. And then when they're in transit, they're on shaky ground, And so then the question comes up that why is it that we have these international documents that are talking about human rights, but when it actually comes to enforcing them and making sure that the progressive realization of these rights implemented in their full spirit of indivisibility, interlinking, infringement of one infringes others, and so on. Why is it that when it comes to that, the whole specter or the boogeyman of state sovereignty suddenly shows up? So I think there are some very important contradictions with the Global Compact and a number of these types of, policies and laws that are related to decent work, for example. The number of contradictions that need to be looked at. Another point that I'd like to make here is that people face structural conditions of inequality, discrimination, whether it's religious, social, racial. Then there's tremendous amounts of exploitation. There are wars, conflicts. There are political, territorial occupations. That's still happening, whether it's Palestine or Kashmir or northeast of India or in Burma or in Cambodia, in indigenous peoples' lands. There's violence and there's threats of violence. There's huge amount of indebtedness. There are, how shall we say, feelings of hopelessness and future insecurity that people in communities face that make them leave their home places and go elsewhere. And these conditions are not being tackled. And I think that's an extremely it's a very alarming situation that we are not able to bring the addressing of these structural conditions into these global documents. And if we look at corporate-led globalization, and if we look at the last 20 to 30 years of economic globalization, and which then was completely dominated by corporations increasingly, this paradigm has failed in its promise of jobs and income from economic prosperity. And instead, we've had sort of recurring financial and economic crises and the expansion of this industrial agriculture, environmental destruction, resource grabbing, land grabbing, all of them have increased poverty and hunger and deprivation. And the reason I'm bringing these points up is because this is very closely related to the creation of a huge mass of group of workers who are the informal sector. And I don't even think that the numbers of how many people are in the informal sector is fully known, because this is a very large and diverse sector, and it includes workers in the agriculture, fisheries, food industries, domestic work, hospitality, entertainment, retail, construction, healthcare. There's home-based income generation. There's extensions of household care that Jean was talking about, you know, where people work in creches and kitchens. Even in hospitals, there are a number of informal sector workers. So the actual numbers of workers in this sector are hard to assess because of the structural conditions and economic exploitation, and because people are moving in and out of this sector. Even, you know, factories in Cambodia, factories across Southeast Asia, where more and more workers have been forced to work, you know, with sort of flexible contracts and labor contractualization. They have high debts. They have to work overtime. So they take on additional informal work. So even those who are in formal work are taking on more and more additional informal work, you know, or work that is not documented, or what might be called, you know, irregular, or whatever the, I'm not sure what, you know, whatever the language is that is used by professionals in this sector. So, you know, this is a sector that's alarmingly dynamic. I mean, on one hand, we could say it's dynamic in a very healthy way, not healthy way, but there's a lot of potential there where people can engage and perhaps forge new working relationships. But it's also a sector where workers' rights, the abuse of workers' rights, violence, exploitation, wage theft are really widespread. Most employment is not through recruiters. Many recruitment agencies are fly by night. And if we look at now under COVID, the kinds of economic recovery packages that are being proposed by most governments, they're pandering again to corporations and big businesses. They're ensuring that they have the corporations have the capital, they have the labor supply, relaxed laws and policies. Labor laws have been relaxed across Asia, for example, and they have the institutional infrastructure to sort of recoup their losses and start raking in the profits. But now in a COVID world, businesses even have the additional leeway to outsource employment and to continue with whatever, you know, conditions that they need to, because they have to recover and restart the economy and so on. So I think, one of the big worries that our colleagues and the movement partners that we work with in rural areas and also urban poor areas are pointing out is that a number of really dangerous practices of human trafficking exploitations are going further underground. And they're creating more and more dangerous situations for victims, and especially for women and young men as well. And workers are finding themselves at greater and greater risk of contracting diseases and viruses and other problems. And also indebtedness has increased so much that in a post-pandemic world, well, there's no post-pandemic world yet, there are very few ways out for people to figure out how will they get their incomes, because the stimulus and this relief packages are not reaching those who those who need them most. So if I have a few minutes left, I'd just like to put some important action points, on the table. One is that, the success of what we see as corporate exploitation or corporate exploitation by corporations, the success of that is very directly linked with the rise of right-wing authoritarianism. And it's very dangerously colored by race, religion, and ethnicity. And these are presenting very particular threats to women and particular social groups and races in a way that we have not seen in a very long time, So I just, picking up again, I think language that Jean brought up, the whole of government, or the whole systemic approach means that one cannot look at the exploitation of workers and the informal and formal sector as differentiated sectors. So economic exploitation, economic violence is very closely linked to criminalization, to political violence, and to social discrimination and that level of violence. So keeping that in mind, some of the action points that I'd like to put, one is that the standards of all workers' rights really must be increased, and these rights must be made legally enforceable. Under the decent work, I can understand why. I mean, of course, there's a whole history behind people who struggle to get the decent work concept and package of policies there. But decent work has also been a response to neoliberal policies and to corporate-led globalization, where basically we're looking at trying to make work better, but not addressing the structural conditions of what made work indecent to begin with. You know, what makes work? What makes people's living conditions, exploitative, abusive, and unacceptable? So related to that, the standards of workers' rights need to be raised much higher, and these rights have to be legally enforceable. Hard law to protect corporations, but soft law for workers is not acceptable. And I think we should not accept it under any code of conduct or anything. Another point is that the power of corporations and financial markets must be dismantled. They must be subjected to legally enforceable regulations and laws. Because if we look even today under COVID-19, at the height of various crises that we have seen, financial markets continue to function and boom and go, swing up and down. But those who are invested in financial markets manage to always get bailed out. And at the cost of who? At the cost of workers. And at the cost of peasants, at the cost of rural communities, at the cost of urban and rural poor. And more workers who once were able to unionize and once were able to do decent work are being pushed through global supply chains into what we call non-decent work, and into contractual and flexibilized work through ease of doing business, and to keep the global economy running. This really has to stop. And I think we need to subject these markets and corporations to legally enforceable laws. Structural conditions that are the root of economic and social and political insecurity really need to be addressed urgently. This includes agrarian reform, rights to land, support for local economies, forced evictions have to end, forced relocations have to end, living wages and workplace protection has to be ensured, and so on. And dealing with entrenched social discrimination, caste, religion, gender, all these, race, have to be addressed, because the largest proportion of informal sector will be within national economies. It's not very easy for people to to be in the informal sector and cross boundaries. And where they do, we see what's happened with the Rohingya, we see what's happening with the migration to Europe and what's happening with Fortress Europe. We're seeing what's happening, in the North American and the Central American borders. We're seeing this in the Mekong region. So in places where informal sector workers or people are forced to move without documents, the costs are horrific. There are graveyards and graveyards being created, and this has to stop. We strongly recommend that free trade and investment agreements must be reviewed from the perspective of workers' rights, and they must be amended. Public regulation must uphold public interest. Public regulation must not hold the interest of trade agreements and corporations. And related to that, we need a very strong emphasis to rebuild the public realm. I mean, if there's one thing that we're getting from, one positive message that's coming out of this whole COVID fiasco, is the importance of the public realm. Essential services such as health, education, social security, energy, transportation, infrastructure, public financing. It's very important to have the public realm, because where will workers go? Where will the urban and rural poor go? Where will even the middle classes go? It's the public realm that we all rely on. And if that is dismantled and chipped away by more neoliberalism and more corporate subsidies, we're not going to get any kind of workers' rights or anybody's rights except corporate interests, shored up. We need to definitely support food sovereignty, the strengthening of local and domestic economies, and worker struggles here. Their rights to organize, their rights to unionize, freedom of association. How do these rights get brought into the informal sector? how does the respect of human rights and the global responsibility of state to protect migrants from being criminalized, from being repressed, from being detained just simply because they're migrants? How do we stop that, you know? And so this actually calls for, you know, a level of visualizing human rights as international law that surpasses and that completely, I hate to use the word trumps, but that completely trumps, you know, business rights. And I think there's a big challenge here with regard to the informal sector, because a lot of people, as you know, in the informal sector, are there not only because of the flexibility that the sector offers them, but because they are there also out of desperation and out of a lack of other options. So how do you then take legal organizing rules to the informal sector without informal sector workers, without people feeling that they're being brought in to be criminalized or regularized somehow? So let me leave it there for the moment. Thank you, and I hope I didn't go overboard here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Shalmali. Actually, a lot of, you know, great points to reflect on. And I really want to thank you for bringing in kind of the larger questions of, you know, what makes, you know, these kinds of jobs that migrant workers do exploitable? What makes it that we have people being pushed into the informal sector? And obviously, people in the informal sectors are doing jobs, so the jobs are there. They're just not enjoying the protections that other workers are also enjoying in the formal sector. And thank you for highlighting the angle around criminalization and how this is really affecting workers and affecting workers' rights. And I think this lens of, you know, rights at the center of it is something we've been, you know, you've brought very strongly. So thank you very much for that.